Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're looking today at a really interesting set of sources you sent over, all about the history of sexual selection. Specifically, how we've tried to figure out those incredibly flashy ornaments on male animals.
Yes, it's a fascinating and sometimes pretty confusing history.
The sources kick off with this really evocative scene. Imagine dawn, Pennine Hills in England. You've got black grouse doing their thing on a leak, strutting, showing off.
Right, this intense biological display.
And nearby, there's this huge boulder, a glacial erratic, covered in these ancient, mysterious carvings, cup and ring marks, thousands of years old.
It's a striking juxtaposition, isn't it? Deep time, raw nature versus this deliberate, almost artistic human impulse. And it frames the central question perfectly.
It is.
Why? Why do male animals like these grouse evolve such, extravagant features, these bright colors, these energetic dances, sometimes huge, maybe even cumbersome tails? Are they just for show? And, what does that show actually mean?
Exactly. So, that's our goal for this deep dive, to unpack that history. We'll look at Darwin's original idea about female choice, which was pretty controversial.
Hugely controversial and largely dismissed for a long time.
Right. And then how it kind of came back, but in a new form, with Ronald Fisher's idea of runaway selection.
Yeah, the sources take us through quite a cast of characters, Darwin, Wallace, of course, but also mentions of Goethe, and then later figures like Fisher and Julian Huxley, key players in the modern synthesis of evolution.
And their perspectives really clash sometimes.
Oh, definitely. It's a real scientific debate, reflecting the thinking of their times, too.
Okay, so let's dive in, starting right back with Darwin himself.
Okay, so Darwin, in The Descent of Man, he lays out his theory of sexual selection. Two main parts. Males fighting each other.
Male competition, yeah.
And the other part, which is key here, female choice. He proposed that females actively choose mates based on certain traits, colors, songs, displays.
And he didn't just think they were choosing based on, health signals.
Well, he went further. He actually suggested female birds, for instance, possessed quite sophisticated aesthetic judgments, that they could appreciate beauty for its own sake.
Wow. Okay. But you said that idea didn't really stick initially.
Not really. According to these sources, after Darwin passed away, the whole female choice thing, especially the aesthetic preference part, was widely considered. Well, the source calls it an embarrassing idea.
Embarrassing? Why would it be embarrassing?
Several reasons floated around. Alfred Russel Wallace, who co-discovered natural selection, he had a different view.
Right, Wallace. What was his take?
Wallace thought the displays were mostly honest signals of male vigor, overall fitness. Basically, only the healthiest, strongest males could afford such flashy displays.
Okay, so that sounds more practical, tied to survival.
Exactly. It seemed more directly linked to natural selection. And frankly, many scientists just couldn't buy the idea that animals, birds or insects, could have human-like aesthetic tastes.
Who argued against it? What were their main points?
Well, the sources mentioned some big names expressing pretty strong skepticism. Thomas Hunt Morgan, a really key figure in early genetics.
Morgan, yeah. What did he say?
In 1903, he apparently called female choice a fiction. He even sort of mocked the idea, did women's preferences cause men's beards to evolve? Or did men select women with less beard? He found it absurd.
Okay, so definite ridicule there.
And Sir Darcy Thompson, in his famous book on growth and form, he was very dismissive, too. Just waved away the peacock's tail as vanity and wantonness.
Yeah.
It just felt frivolous, maybe unscientific to many.
So it wasn't just a lack of proof, but a kind of fundamental doubt about animal minds.
That seems to be a big part of it, yeah. People like Gene Stoltzman or Geddes and Thompson later in the 1880s, they just struggled to conceive how an animal brain could make what they saw as complex aesthetic choices.
But the sources push back on that a bit, right? With an analogy.
They do, and it's a good one. They say, look, you don't need to understand physics or calculus to catch a ball, right? Your brain and body just figure it out.
Right.
Or you don't need to be a wine expert, a sommelier, to enjoy a nice glass of champagne. It just tastes good.
Okay, get that.
So maybe birds don't need, a degree in art history to find certain colors or displays appealing. It could be an instinctive preference, something innate. Lloyd Morgan suggested it might be as simple as a chick instinctively pecking at a juicy worm. It just works.
That makes sense. An instinctual response. But Darwin himself, he seemed to insist on something more like genuine aesthetic judgment. Why was that so important to him?
Well, according to Helena Cronin's analysis mentioned in the sources, Darwin had a broader agenda. He really wanted to show the continuity between humans and other animals.
Break down that idea of human exceptionalism.
Exactly. If animals could appreciate beauty, that was another link. He was also influenced by thinkers like Burke, apparently seeing human appreciation of beauty as having erotic origins. So finding it in animal sexual display fit his view. It just seemed to cut the knot, as the source puts it, explaining these otherwise puzzling traits.
Interesting. So it served a larger philosophical purpose for him, too. Did anyone try to, actually test this early on? Any experiments?
Very few, and pretty basic ones. The sources talk about Frank Finn in Calcutta around 1909. He apparently put some female red munia finches in a cage with males of different colors.
No. What happened?
Well, one female seemed to prefer a bright scarlet male over a duller coppery one, but another female showed no preference at all, so hardly conclusive.
Right.
And interestingly, Finn and his co-author, Douglas Dewar, they were actually skeptical of both Darwin and Wallace. They leaned more towards the idea that big evolutionary changes happen because of mutations, not necessarily selection.
So female choice was kind of stuck on the sidelines, but not completely forgotten. You mentioned Germany.
Yeah, there were some sparks there. August Weismann, back in the 1880s, he actually gave Darwin's sexual selection theory a more positive spin. He pushed back against Wallace's vigor idea.
How so?
He suggested females weren't cool, dispassionate judges, but maybe more like excitable persons, drawn to males who, well, excited them the most strongly. It shifts the focus back to the female's reaction.
Okay. And then there was Wilhelm Bolsche. Sounds like a character.
Apparently so. A popular science writer, follower of Ernst Haeckel. His book, The Love Life in Nature, was a huge bestseller in 1898. He went all in on sexual selection, with what the sources call salacious enthusiasm, very anthropomorphic language talking about orgasmic ecstasy in birds of paradise during display.
Wow.
So while it might have popularized the idea of sexual selection, that kind of, flowery, perhaps overly imaginative description probably didn't help its standing with the more empirical, serious scientists of the day.
Yeah, I can see that. What about Carl Groos? The sources mention him trying to bridge the gap somehow.
Groos wrote about animal play. Initially, he kind of accepted Wallace's view that females probably weren't making conscious choices. But like others, he felt Wallace's idea of surplus vitality just couldn't explain the sheer extravagance you see in some ornaments, like way beyond just signaling, I'm healthy.
So what was his solution?
He picked up on something Wallace himself conceded, that maybe bright colors could be an indicator of health. So if females were picking the brightest, healthiest males, even unconsciously, that was a form of choice.
Ah, okay.
Bruce called it unconscious choosing. His key insight really was that if a male's display simply stimulates the female enough to make her ready to mate, that stimulation itself is effectively the same as being chosen.
So it's not about aesthetics just triggering the mating response.
Kind of. His quote is quite telling. The female is undoubtedly more easily won by the male that most strongly excites her sexual instinct. He tried to frame it as involuntary, maybe to make it more palatable scientifically then, but he was essentially saying the female's response is the selection mechanism.
Okay, so Groos is subtly bringing the female's reaction back into the picture as crucial, which sets the stage. Because this is where things get really interesting, right? With the return of Darwin's core idea, but with a totally new twist.
Exactly, and that twist comes from Ronald Fisher.
Fisher. A major figure, mathematician, biologist.
Yeah, a true giant. Pioneer of modern statistics, population genetics. The sources also note his involvement with the eugenics movement, which they mention was quite widespread across the political spectrum back then. They even cite his correspondence with Julian Huxley about things like sterilization proposals.
Right. Important context provided by the sources, even if difficult. But his contribution here was about female choice.
Yes, but he asked a fundamentally different question. Not if females choose, which was still debated, but why they choose.
Darwin hadn't really nailed the why, had he? It was sort of, they just like beauty.
Pretty much, yeah. It felt a bit vague, maybe circular. Fisher wanted a proper mechanistic explanation grounded in genetics.
And he found one. In his 1930 book, The Genetical Theory of Natural Selection. What was the core idea?
It's all about the success of the next generation, specifically the sons. Fisher realized, look, it's not just about having lots of offspring. Those offspring, especially the males in these displaying species, need to be successful breeders themselves.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
So if a female picks a dull male,
Her sons might inherit that dullness, and if females in that species prefer flashy males, those dull sons won't get mates. Her lineage could fizzle out.
Which leads to the sexy son hypothesis.
Exactly. Fisher didn't coin that phrase, but it captures it perfectly. A female choosing a glamorous, attractive male isn't necessarily choosing the best male in terms of survival genes, but she is increasing the odds that her sons will inherit that attractiveness.
And therefore be chosen by the next generation of females.
Precisely. As Fisher wrote in a letter to Darwin's grandson, Charles Galton Darwin, who we'll come back to, he said, "Tasteful hens don't rear more chicks, but their sons are finer and get more grand chicks."
Grand chicks, okay. So that creates a feedback loop.
A really powerful one. This is the runaway process. What happens is the female preference for a trait, say a slightly longer tail, and the genes for that longer tail in males, they can become genetically linked.
How does that work?
Well, females who prefer longer tails mate with males who have longer tails. Their offspring inherit both the tendency for long tails, if they're male, and the preference for long tails, if they're female.
I see. So the preference itself gets passed on alongside the trait.
Yes. Which means females with stronger preferences have sons who are more likely to be successful, which in turn favors females with even stronger preferences.
It feeds back on itself, an arms race.
Exactly. The preference drives the trait, and the trait reinforces the preference. And this can lead to the trait becoming incredibly exaggerated, potentially very quickly.
And here's the crucial part, right? The trait doesn't actually need to signal anything good, like health or survival ability.
That's the revolutionary and maybe counterintuitive bit. Once this preference gets established, even if it started randomly, the strongest selective pressure on a female might simply be to choose males that other females find attractive. Why? Because if she doesn't, her sons won't be attractive.
She becomes, as the source says, a slave to fashion.
In a way, yes. The cost of having unfashionable, unsexy sons is too high. It overrides other considerations.
So the peacock's massive tail, or the energy a grouse uses displaying that, might actually make them worse at surviving, more vulnerable to predators.
Absolutely. But if that tail, that display, is what females are selecting for, the trait still gets amplified by sexual selection, even if it opposes natural selection for survival.
So reproduction can trump survival here.
Reproduction of the sexiest, as some have put it, can beat survival of the fittest in this context. Fisher saw this clearly. It's what the ornithologist Richard Prum, quoted in the sources, means by desire for beauty will undermine the desire for truth. The arbitrary preference overrides any signal of underlying quality.
There's that anecdote about the grouse, black spot.
Yes, a dominant black grouse on a leek observed spending so much energy displaying and mating that he became completely exhausted, likely didn't survive the following winter. The drive to display, driven by female choice, potentially cost him his life, but presumably not before passing on his genes.
And Fisher thought this runaway process could be fast.
He did. He suggested it could accelerate, happen at an ever-increasing speed, maybe in sudden and rapid bursts, which could explain how these really extreme ornaments evolve relatively quickly.
It makes me think of that analogy again, the one the sources use with the Bronze Age cup and ring marks.
Right. It's just an analogy. Obviously, humans are different. But imagine if, for some forgotten reason, women in a particular Bronze Age culture only wanted to marry men who carved the best cup and rings.
Okay.
The initial reason doesn't matter anymore. It becomes this tyrannical fashion. If you're a woman, you might find a perfectly strong, capable man, but if he's a lousy carver, maybe your sons won't get married, so you choose the good carver.
So the preference for good carving drives the evolution of carving skills, regardless of whether carving actually means anything else.
Exactly. The trait, the carving, or the peacock's tail works simply because it works to get mates. Taste for beauty causes beauty, which causes taste for beauty, as the source puts it.
That's quite a thought. It's a mechanism for Darwin's beauty for its own sake.
It is. It suggests beauty might not be a signal of something else useful, but the actual thing being selected just because it gets chosen.
And this runaway idea, does it help explain why we see such incredible variety in ornaments? Like, why peacocks have tails, but birds of paradise have crazy feathers and dances?
Absolutely. Because the process is arbitrary, it can latch on to almost any heritable trait that shows some initial variation.
Tail length, color patch, a wiggle in a dance, a specific song note?
Right. Once a preference for that specific thing starts, the runaway process can take it off in its own unique direction. That's why different grouse species, even displaying near each other on lakes, can have completely different display routines.
The sources mention simulations. Miller, and Todd.
Yes, showing how even tiny initial differences in preference could lead populations down vastly different evolutionary paths in the abstract space of possible ornament designs. Really diverse outcomes from a simple mechanism.
And this is different from, say, how male weapons evolve, like antlers.
Very different. With weapons used for fighting, like antlers, there's a strong functional constraint. An antler that's too big and unwieldy might actually make you lose fights. You can't bluff effectively.
Right. Physics gets in the way.
Exactly. But with ornaments driven purely by female preference, there isn't that same hard functional limit. They can become absurdly exaggerated, limited only when the survival cost finally becomes too high to bear.
Okay, so Fisher has this incredibly powerful idea, runaway selection. You mentioned he corresponded with Darwin's grandson about it.
Yes, Charles Galton Darwin, C.G. Darwin. He was initially skeptical. He thought Fisher was double counting, arguing it was just one effect. The cock is only fine because the hen is artistic.
How did Fisher respond?
He actually sent C.G. Darwin a mathematical model in 1932, like take X for cock beauty and Y for hen taste, and showed mathematically how the rate of change could accelerate. This was the proof.
The mathematical proof of runaway selection? Was that published?
No, that's the amazing thing. It stayed in their private letters, apparently undiscovered in archives until 1999.
Wow. That's bizarre.
And the sources note this strange coincidence. Fisher's model of a biological chain reaction came just months before Leo Szilard conceived of a nuclear chain reaction in 1933. Very different fields, obviously, but a conceptual echo.
Why wouldn't Fisher publish such a crucial piece of his theory? The sources speculate.
They do. One suggestion is that it might have, ironically, clashed with his own support for eugenics.
How so?
Well, if mate choice could become completely arbitrary, latching onto traits with no connection to underlying health or fitness, how could you then argue, as eugenicists did, that people had a duty to choose mates based on promoting those fit qualities for the good of the race or species? Runaway selection shows preference can go totally off-piste, favoring the merely attractive over the genuinely good in a biological sense. It's kind of anti-eugenic in its implications.
That's a really interesting thought. So maybe he held back because it complicated his other views.
It's speculation, but plausible. Whatever the reason, the mathematical core of runaway selection wasn't widely known for decades.
So despite Fisher's logic, and even some field observations popping up like Edmund Sellis watching ruffs, which Fisher actually noted.
Yes, Sellis provided vivid descriptions of female ruffs seeming to choose among displaying males.
Despite all that, sexual selection and female choice kind of went back into hibernation from the 20s through to like the 70s.
Largely, yes. Ignored or actively dismissed by many mainstream biologists during the formation of the modern evolutionary synthesis.
And the sources point to Julian Huxley, another Darwin grandson, as a key figure in that.
Yes, his influence is portrayed as, well, almost wholly malign in the sources regarding the fate of sexual selection theory. Huxley was a very prominent biologist, science administrator, a major architect of the modern synthesis.
But he was skeptical. Why?
His own early field work was often on birds like grebes and divers. These are mostly monogamous species where elaborate displays often happen after the pair bond has already formed.
Ah, so it didn't look like mate choice display to him. It looked like pair bond strengthening or something else.
Exactly. That seemed to shape his view. And his position, as documented in the sources, seemed to shift around a bit over time.
How so?
Well, in 1927, he co-authored a book that actually mentioned selection being exercised by the mind of the female. Then he wrote the introduction to Sellis's book on ruffs, conceding that Sellis showed Darwin's idea definitely held good for the ruff.
So he acknowledged it, at least for ruffs.
He did, even saying in 1930 that for ruffs, at least the essence of the Darwinian hypothesis seems proved. But then, just a year earlier, in the big popular book, The Science of Life, he wrote with H.G. Wells, he'd curtly dismissed display as merely prompting the act of mating rather than to the choice of marriage partner.
Contradictory. And what was his final position when he became really influential in the modern synthesis?
By the late 1930s and 40s, he seems to have really hardened against it. In a major 1938 essay, he dogmatically stated that many characters Darwin thought were sexual actually had other functions.
Did he engage with Fisher's runaway idea?
Barely. The source says he mentioned it in just a single sentence before changing the subject. He basically wanted to fold everything under natural selection, said we need no special category for sexual selection, and he explicitly concluded Darwin's original contention about female choice will not hold.
Wow. Coming from him, that would have carried huge weight. So if display wasn't about female choice, driving runaway selection, or even necessarily Wallace's idea of signaling vigor. What did Huxley and others think it was for?
They threw out several alternatives. One popular idea was intimidating other males.
Male competition again.
Right. Echoing people like Richard Hingston, who called bright colors intimidating machinery. But as the sources point out, why does a peacock fold up its massive train when it actually starts fighting another male? It doesn't seem very intimidating then.
Good point. What else?
Species recognition, helping birds tell their own kind apart. Plausible, maybe, but lots of dull-colored species manage that just fine without elaborate displays.
Okay.
Then there were some stranger ideas, like ornaments acting as predator decoys, like an eat me sign on the male to draw predators away from the female or nest.
That seems evolutionarily tricky. Self-sacrifice is hard to evolve.
Very hard. Plus, predators do eat the ornamented males. Or the opposite idea that bright colors were warning signals to predators, saying, don't eat me, I'm toxic or dangerous.
Which contradicts the decoy idea.
Exactly, and most ornamented species aren't toxic, so none of these alternatives seemed entirely convincing for the really extravagant stuff.
What about that other idea, the epigamic display, just stimulating the female?
Yes, that became quite dominant. The idea that display primarily served a psychophysiological function, it stimulated the female's nervous system, got her hormones going, basically made her physiologically ready and willing to mate without any conscious choice involved.
This wasn't a new idea.
No, it had roots going back to Miffart, Polton, Kellogg thinkers from the late 19th, early 20th century. Huxley championed this view.
But the sources are critical of this too.
They are. They argue, much like Gruss did earlier, that effectively stimulating a female is a form of selection. If multiple males are displaying, and only the one whose display is stimulating enough actually gets to mate, then his display has been effectively chosen.
It's selection by stimulation threshold, maybe.
You could put it that way. And they point to examples like black grouse or Argus pheasants, where females actively go to the display grounds. They're clearly motivated to mate, but they watch multiple males, sometimes for a long time, before soliciting copulation from one. That looks an awful lot like active discrimination based on the performance. That looks like choice.
Right, not just passive stimulation.
And the sources offer a pretty pointed interpretation here, suggesting that maybe the preference for this epigamic stimulation theory was partly driven by a reluctance, perhaps reflecting the social biases of the time, to really grapple with the idea of active female preference, maybe even female desire or lust. Seeing the female as passively triggered rather than an active agent in choosing.
That's a strong claim, attributing it to potential sexism.
It is presented as an interpretation in the source material of why this particular theory gained traction over female choice.
So the end result was that by the time Huxley published his landmark book, Evolution, The Modern Synthesis, in 1942,
sexual selection got incredibly short shrift. Just a single page in a massive, hugely influential volume that shaped evolutionary biology for decades.
And other key books of the synthesis
barely mentioned it or ignored it altogether. So despite Seelow seeing it in the field, despite Fisher providing a powerful theoretical engine for it, the whole idea of sexual selection driven by female choice was, as the source says, pretty much dead and buried by the mid-20th century.
Even while, ironically, society outside of biology labs was starting to change its views on the roles and agency of women.
Exactly. A real disconnect there.
Okay, so what a journey. From Darwin's really bold, maybe slightly anthropomorphic idea of female aesthetic choice,
which got dismissed as embarrassing or nonsensical,
through Fisher's incredibly clever but maybe too counterintuitive sexy son and runaway theory, which itself got sidelined,
to its eventual suppression by figures like Huxley, who preferred explanations focusing on male competition or general stimulation, effectively erasing female agency from the picture for decades.
It really brings us back to that core tension, doesn't it? Between the Wallace view ornaments as honest signals of quality, of vigor,
and the Fisher-Darwin view ornaments as potentially arbitrary results of a runaway fashion cycle driven by preference itself.
Yeah.
Beauty that works just because it's beautiful to the chooser.
And that Fisher idea that beauty in nature might sometimes be, as the sources put it, meaningless but wonderful, that's quite profound. Not a sign of truth or fitness, but just a beautiful outcome of an evolutionary process.
It really is. It decouples beauty from necessarily signaling pragmatic value.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with a final thought to chew on. If this arbitrary fashion-like runaway process can drive evolution to create something as stunningly complex and seemingly useless as a peacock's tail or a grouse's display.
Simply because a preference took hold and amplified itself.
What else might it explain? Could other complex traits, maybe even some aspects of human behavior or culture where mate choice plays a role, have roots in similar ancient arbitrary preferences that just ran away?
What other potentially meaningless but wonderful features of the living world might owe their existence not to strict utility, but to the quirky, powerful dynamics of desire and choice? Something to think about.
Indeed. Thank you for sharing these fascinating